say Happy Easter?
No.
Okay, we'll go. All right. As you can say, one of mine is having a tough time this afternoon. He is exhausted. So this week we're going to take a little different route. We are going to talk about Hannah. I like this. I stumbled upon it. I changed it up a little bit. And I had never thought about looking at Hannah and praying and what we can learn from her prayer. Or learn by what she did. And the thing that sticks out in my mind about Hannah is her being kicked out of the temple because they thought she was drunk when she wasn't. And the fact that she wanted a boy and couldn't have one. So I found this devotional pretty interesting. And I hope you all do. So that is do as well. So that's what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes, is what we can learn from Hannah's prayer. And we find the story of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapters 1 through 3. And most of you all, or I'm assuming most of you all, know this story. If not, like I said, we can go back and read it in chapters 1 through 3 of 1 Samuel. But we know that Hannah was not able to have children. And she wanted a son more than anything else in the world. And we are told her and her husband went to Shiloh once a year so that Elkanah, which is her husband, could offer sacrifices. Well, while they were there, one year they went up there, and while they were there, Hannah went into the tabernacle and prayed. And we all know what happens next. The priest there named Eli accuses Hannah of being drunk. She was in a corner praying to God to let her have a son, and if he did let her have a son, she promised to give him back to the Lord. And we don't know. Some people think, they just said that her mouth was moving, but no words were coming out. Some people think she was doing this in silent, just kind of acting crazy. Some people think that she was very loud, just wailing very loudly, weeping very loudly, kind of causing a scene. We talked about last week being a distraction. So we're not really sure which one it was, but either way, this priest sees her. Eli goes up to her, accuses her of being drunk, and makes her get out of the temple. So we know that Hannah left, and her and her husband went back home. And when they got home, she ended up having a son, and she kept her promise. She promised God that if he gave her a son, that she would give him back to him. And she called her son Samuel. And then we know lots of things that Samuel did throughout the Bible. So that's kind of where I want to start, is we got to think how hard this had to have been of Hannah. All her life, she wanted a son. Wanted a son so bad because the son was prestigious back then. He's the one who carried on your family name. She wanted a son, but she couldn't have one. She wasn't able not only not to have a son, she couldn't have kids, period. And then, but she wanted it so bad that she promised the Lord, she knew, number one, the Lord would give it to her. So she went to the Lord and asked. And when she did get pregnant, she gave her son, took him to the temple, and left him there so he could grow up in the Lord. Could you imagine how hard that would be? As you all can see, as you saw at the beginning of this, my son's having a hard time right now. He's tired. He's cranky. He's whining. He's screaming. There are times that I could think, man, I might be able to give him up for an hour or two. I might need that break. But knowing that this was my only son, and knowing that I had to turn him over and I wouldn't be able to raise him, that had to be hard. I cannot wrap my mind around how she did this. How she could go. We know they went up once a year, so at the most she might see her son once a year. And just all the things she missed out on. But we know that it was very hard of Hannah. And we know that she kept her promise. So looking at that, I want us to look at 5 things today we can learn from Hannah, specifically dealing with her prayer. And we're going to start off, and some of us, childbearing comes naturally, and some of us, it doesn't come so naturally. We struggle, or there might be some issues, or there might be some things we don't know what's going on. Some of us, it seems like every time we turn around somebody, that person's getting pregnant. And then we know some that are struggling and have struggled for years that want to have a child and either can't or there's something wrong. So That's kind of, we can see where Hannah is at on this spectrum. You have the ones that they decide it's time to start a family. Everything goes along as expected, and the babies are born right on schedule. For others, like Hannah and a lot of people in this world, it's not that way. So when we read the story of Hannah, we can kind of understand a little bit of Hannah's heart, especially if we are someone who had a hard time having a child, if we are someone who was blessed with a child, but then it was taken away from us at an early age, maybe by death or some other event that happened. And I think when I was doing this devotional, I guess the older I'm getting, I can see more and more people that can relate to Hannah. When I was younger, I thought, it's just easy to have kids. You just have kids. Well, now having 2 children myself, it's not as easy as everybody says it is. Or when you think you're young and you think, it's just so easy to have a kid. So we can relate. Some of us can relate to Hannah more than others. So I want us to think about that. And then there's some things that Hannah had that we don't have. We don't have a Peninnah to agonize us and throw in our face all the time, look at me, I'm just having all these kids and you're no good. We don't have that constant nagging, that constant thorn in our side, if you will. We don't have the cultural pressure to have a son to carry on the family heritage. Yes, most people may like a son, but right now I hear more and more when someone gets pregnant, I just want a healthy child. I don't care if it's a boy or a girl, and that's how we were. We don't have that cultural pressure of you have to have a son. It is just detrimental. You have to have a son. But when we read of Hannah in the tabernacle, she is crying. She's crying out her soul's deep longing to have a child. And so we, some degree, can know how she felt. For us who have had kids, if there was complications or maybe it wasn't as easy to get pregnant as we thought, we can sympathize or we can see where Hannah was coming from. From those of us who aren't able to have kids, we definitely can see where Hannah's coming from. For us that have had children, we can still see how it would be so hard to give your child up, especially if it's your only child, and give him up to God. So no matter what category you fall into, we can, to some degree, see how Hannah felt and feel the same way in some aspects. But as we look at Hannah's plea, the lessons we learn from her about prayer can apply to any hardship, any anxiety, any sorrow, or any disappointment that we go through today. Hannah was a woman who had a heartfelt need. She took it to God, and she saw him answer her request. And those are 3 things we can do today. We all, no matter who you are, have a heartfelt need. At some point in time, we have had a heartfelt need, probably more than once. Did we take it to God? And if we did take it to God, did we see him answer our request? So that's what we're going to look at today. There's 5 things that I want to point out in Hannah's prayer that relates to us. And the first thing that we can learn is every heartache and every emotion can be brought to God. There's no trial too difficult, no pain too sharp, no burden too heavy that God can't help us bear it. So no matter what it is, take it to God. In 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 10, it says, she, Hannah, was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. What was she? She was deeply distressed, not just a little out of sorts. She was deeply distressed, deeply bothered, deeply grieving. She prayed and she wept. She cried. She mourned. She was sorrowful. Those are 3 things she did, but she went to the Lord. Then we keep going, and in verse 15, it says, but Hannah answered, no, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. So this is how deeply she let her emotions show, that she was so beside herself that people were thinking she was drunk. But that is her prayer to God. That is how personal she got to God. Do we get that personal? Do we look at God as a parent, someone we can confide in? When I was studying this, I thought about the mother-daughter relationship and how I miss that. I don't have my mother anymore to go to. I don't have my father to go to and talk about things that have bothered me. Or, if something bad goes wrong, the first thing I did was pick up the phone and call mom or dad and say, hey, this just happened. What do I do? If something good, I got pregnant, or we got a promotion, or whatever, we graduated, whatever, what do? You pick up the phone and you call somebody who cares. You call a parent, you call a friend, you call somebody in your family. You want to share that news with them. Do we treat God the same way? Do we treat God? Do we tell God everything that's going on? The good stuff, the bad stuff, when we're crying, when we feel like we've been torn into, do we go to God like Hannah did? And we see in verse 15, we're told that she poured out her soul before the Lord. We are to tell God every hurt we feel. And because He is able to empathize with every feeling we're having, He knows exactly what we're going through. And we're supposed to take everything to Him. The good, the bad, the sad, the happy. We're supposed to take everything to Him. Do we? So that's the first thing. Every heartache and raw emotion, bring it to God. Secondly, God is the only one who can solve our problem. In 1 Samuel 1 verse 5, it says, but to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. And we see here that this is Elkanah. He gave Hannah a double portion of his earnings, of everything he had, because he felt sorry for her, because he did love her. And he knew Peninnah however you say it, was able to bless him with children. He did do lawfully right by her. He gave her her portion, but he gave Hannah Hubble. I need to quit. This is just a bad devotional. He gave Hannah double because he loved her. He loved her more. And he did that because he knew the Lord had closed her womb. So in this verse, like we just said, we see that the Lord had shut up Hannah's womb. There was no special technique, no medicine, no person that could resolve this issue. Only prayer. How often do we want to look at everything around us, all the solutions to our problems around us, or relief from our trials of the worldly things, of going to other people, instead of realizing that going to God in prayer should be our first resort, not our last. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think it's wrong to go out and seek help from other people. I don't think it's wrong if you're having an issue to go to someone else and say, hey, I'm having this problem. What can I do about it? Or if something good has happened, going to people. That's not what this is saying. And I think the last part of this really hits the nail on the head. Do we go to God first or last? And Hannah went to God first. God should be our first resort, not our last. And that's the second thing. God is the only one who can solve our problem. And back then, with this particular situation, like we said, they didn't have the medical stuff that we have today. They didn't have the medicine. They didn't have all the things that we have today. So the only person she could turn to is God. But she didn't try everything else and then go to God. She immediately went to God. Thirdly, that one thing I want to see is when we leave our cares with God, we can move on with our life. We no longer have that baggage. When Hannah leaves the tabernacle after praying, she's no longer sad. She walks in, she's sad, she prays to God. We see she has strong emotions. She weeps bitterly after she gets it all out of her system. After she talks to God, she's like a burden is lifted. The weight is lifted off of her shoulders, and she is no longer sad. And we see this in 1 Samuel 1 verses 18. And it says, and she said, let your servant find favor in your eyes. Then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Obviously, right here, the woman we're talking about is Hannah. So once we have unburdened our soul to the only one who can solve our problems, which she said that's God, we need to leave it with God. Leave it, walk away from it, let God do what he needs to do. Hannah didn't continue to mope around. She was trusting God to answer her prayer in his way and in his time. So that is where the patience comes in that we all struggle with from time to time, being patient. But she did what she needed to do. She had a problem. She went to God. She let it all out. She talked to him. And then she said, okay, it's no longer my problem. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm going to go and she has a whole new outlook on life. She's no longer sad. She eats and continues on her way, and she is happy. So that's the third thing. We just need to leave it with God. The fourth thing we can learn from this prayer is we need to take time to recognize our answered prayers. Twice, Hannah acknowledges that God directly answered her prayer. And we see it in 1 Samuel 1 verses 20 and in chapter 1 verses 27. In verse 20, it says, "And in due time, Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel. For she said, I have asked from him from the Lord." So she asked him from the Lord in verse 20. Verse 27, "For this child I have prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him." So we see in verse 27, this child I have prayed, the Lord granted him to me. Give God the glory he is due. Celebrate answers to a prayer by offering thanks to God and by sharing stories of answered prayers with others. Share the good news. Tell other people what God has done for you. Our own faith is always encouraged when we hear how God has worked in direct response to prayers in others' lives. And I think that is so true. We may not think big things, but we're always out telling stories with our friends. We're always exchanging stories wherever we're at. And you never know when that one story could just be what someone else is wanting to listen to, just something else that can encourage someone else to show them that there is a God, that God does care about us, that God will provide for us in his time. And we need to be thankful. How often do we pray for something and God grants that prayer and we just go on? It's like, oh, okay, we knew it was going to happen. Yes, God gave this to me. God took care of this problem. God resolved this in this way. But we never give thanks. We just move on until the next problem comes on. How many times do we really sit down and in our prayers thank God for what he's done, thank God for what he's given us, and thank God for prayers that have been answered maybe years ago or months ago or weeks ago? We need to always give God the thanks that he is due. And lastly, the last thing that I want us to get from Hannah's prayer is know that God so often gives us more than we ask for. In 1 Samuel 2 verses 21, it says, "Indeed, the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew in the presence of the Lord." Okay, what did Hannah ask for in chapter 1? A son. What did she end up getting? 3 sons and 2 daughters. She asked for a child. She said she would give it to God. She did, and yet God gave her so much more. He gave her for someone who had longed to have a child, couldn't have children. Now she's had 5. How blessed she was to have 5. So, we have to remember that God gives us so much more than what we ask for at certain times. So this week, I want us to praise God for the privilege that we have to bring all of our concerns, our worries, and our troubles to him. He loves us and knows the desires of our heart and has the power to bring to pass what is best for us. Not what we think is best for us, but what is best for us. So God knows. So in Hannah's prayer, we want to be like Hannah in the fact that we need to know that we can take anything and everything to God. We need to know that God's the only one who can solve our problem. Thirdly, we need to, once we go to God and tell him our troubles, tell him our cares, tell him our happiness, our great news, our excitement, whatever, move on. Leave it with God and move on. Don't dwell on it. Don't let it take your life away from you. Leave it with God and move on. Fourthly, we need to take time to recognize his answered prayer. And last, we need to realize that God gives us so much more than we ever ask for. So this week, think about that. Think about Hannah. Next time you pray, think about your prayer. And Hannah was in a pretty rough spot, a pretty bad spot, and God brought her out of it. So just know that God is always there for us. God is always listening, and he will always listen to our prayers. And I think that's all I have for this week. So I'm working on a devotional for next week. I told you it was going to be an Easter one. I kind of changed it. We are going to do something I call God's Garden. Some of you all may know what that is, but that is what I'm working on. So I hope you all have a great week, and I will see you all here next week. Thank you for listening.